They called her worthless, a discarded piece of a much grander puzzle. For years, Amelia Hayes believed them. Her ex-husband, Richard Sterling, had chiseled the word into her very soul, leaving her a hollowed-out shell of the woman she once was. But what happens when the one person society dismisses is seen as a priceless treasure by a man who owns the world? This is the story of how a forgotten ex-wife left with nothing but shattered dreams found herself in the arms of a reclusive billionaire, Adrian Thorne, who didn't just give her a new life. He gave her a crown. The silence in Amelia Hayes's small apartment was a living thing. It breathed in the scent of turpentine and old paper that clung to her clothes and filled the spaces where a husband's laughter used to be, or more accurately, where his criticisms used to echo. It had been 2 years since the divorce. 2 years since Richard Sterling had surgically removed her from his pristine, upwardly mobile life, declaring her an uninspired, worthless accessory he could no longer afford to be seen with. The words had been his parting gift, delivered with the same casual cruelty he employed when returning a slightly overcooked steak at a restaurant. Amelia traced the delicate fracture line on a porcelain teacup she was restoring. The piece, a late 18th century Meissen, was far more valuable than anything else in her cramped Boston walk-up. It was a commission from a small antique shop in Beacon Hill, one of the few places that recognized her rare talent. To her the cup was a kindred spirit. Broken, discarded, but with a history and an inherent beauty that only a patient hand could reveal. Her work was a quiet rebellion against Richard's narrative. He had always sneered at her dusty hobbies, urging her to focus on more socially acceptable pursuits like hosting vapid dinner parties or chairing meaningless charity committees. Her passion for history, for the stories objects held, was in his eyes a character flaw. "You spend more time with dead people's junk than with me." Amelia, he'd once said, gesturing dismissively at the 19th century secretaire she'd lovingly brought back from the brink of ruin. "It's common. It's a commoner's pastime." Now his voice was a ghost that haunted the quiet apartment, a constant, insidious whisper that fed her deepest insecurities. She saw his judgment in the tired reflection that stared back from the window pane, a woman of 34 with sorrow in her eyes and hands stained with varnish. She had given him the best decade of her life, molding herself into the perfect corporate wife. She'd learned about stock portfolios, feigned interest in golf, and smiled placidly at his lecherous business partners. In return, he had taken her confidence, her friends who had all been his friends, she realized too late, and her sense of self. The divorce settlement had been insultingly small, a calculated move to ensure she would struggle. And she did. Part-time at the antique shop, freelance restoration work, and a crushing weight of student debt from an art history degree she'd never been allowed to use professionally. Some days the ghost of his voice won. She would stare at a half-finished project, the intricate work blurring through a film of tears, and the word would surface from the depths of her memory, worthless. On those days she would put down her tools, wrap herself in a threadbare blanket, and let the silence swallow her whole. Today was one of those days. A letter had arrived that morning, a crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the opulent crest of Sterling and Vanguard Richards' investment firm. It was an invitation. Not for her, of course, but a generic announcement of his engagement to a woman named Cassandra Vanderbilt. The name alone felt like a slap. It was old money, a name that dripped with the prestige Richard had always craved. The accompanying photo in the society pages online showed them on a yacht in Monaco, Richard tanned and smugly triumphant. Cassandra, a blonde polished jewel, 25 years of age, her smile as bright and empty as a showroom. Amelia crumpled the announcement in her fist, the sharp edges of the cardstock digging into her palm. She could hear him so clearly. "You see, Amelia, this is what a successful man has by his side, not a mousy little hobbyist who smells of wood glue." The porcelain teacup sat on her workbench, its delicate floral pattern a stark contrast to the ugliness coiling in her gut. She had been so careful with it, spending hours meticulously cleaning the fracture, preparing the adhesive. Now she wanted to smash it. She wanted to hurl it against the wall and watch it explode into 1,000 irreparable pieces, a reflection of how she felt inside. But she didn't. Instead, She took a deep shuddering breath, the scent of turpentine a strangely grounding anchor. Smashing it would be giving in. It would be an admission of defeat, a confirmation of Richard's verdict. With trembling hands she picked up a fine-tipped brush, dipped it in a tiny pot of gold-leaf paint, and began the delicate art of kintsugi, the Japanese method of repairing broken pottery with lacquer dusted or mixed with powdered gold. She wasn't just fixing the cup. She was highlighting its brokenness, transforming its scars into a testament of its history, its resilience. As she traced the fracture with a shimmering line of gold, a quiet resolve settled over her. Richard had tried to break her, to discard her like a flawed piece of china. He had told her she was worthless. But here in the quiet solitude of her apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Amelia Hayes was slowly, painstakingly putting herself back together, one golden seam at a time. She just didn't know that someone was about to see the value not in the repaired object, but in the artist who held the brush. The Chandler collection was less of an auction house and more of a sanctuary for the world's most coveted artifacts. Tucked away on a quiet cobblestone street in Boston's historic district, it operated on a level of discretion that made its more famous competitors seem like garish department stores. There were no public viewings, no glossy catalogs mailed to the masses. One received an invitation or one did not. Amelia was only there because the owner, a crotchety but brilliant historian named Mr. Abernathy, occasionally hired her for her expertise in authenticating and restoring antique manuscripts. That Tuesday, she was hunched over a collection of 16th-century letters, her brow furrowed in concentration as she examined the watermarks on the delicate parchment. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather and beeswax polish. It was her haven. Ms. Hayes. Mr. Abernathy's gruff voice cut through her focus. A client requires a consultation. The gallery. Amelia looked up, surprised. Clients at the Chandler collection rarely interacted with freelance staff. They dealt with Mr. Abernathy and his impeccably tailored account managers. Wiping her hands on her linen apron, she followed him out of the archives and into the main viewing gallery. The room was hushed, dominated by a massive Flemish tapestry and glass cases holding impossibly rare items. A single man stood with his back to them, studying a display of medieval astronomical instruments. He was tall and lean-dressed in a simple dark gray cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. There was no ostentation about him. Yet he commanded the space with an unnerving stillness. Mr. Thorne Abernathy said, his tone deferential in a way Amelia had never heard before. "This is Amelia Hayes, our foremost specialist in Renaissance-era documents and artifacts." The man turned. Amelia felt her breath catch. It wasn't that he was movie star handsome, though his features were striking, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through her. It was the intensity of his gaze. It was as if he was analyzing her, cataloging her in the same way she had just been studying the watermarks on the letters. "Mr. Thorne has a particular interest in the Vesalius portfolio," Abernathy explained, gesturing toward a leather-bound collection of anatomical drawings under glass. Amelia's professional instincts took over a welcome shield against the man's unnerving presence. Ah, yes. The De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a magnificent second edition print. The detail in the woodcuts is extraordinary, far superior to the first edition in my opinion. Vesalius supervised the printing himself in Basel. She moved closer to the case, pointing out a subtle detail in the engraving of a human skeleton. "You see here the shading on the clavicle. It suggests a different block cutter was used for this section, one with a much finer hand. Most people miss that." She spoke with the quiet passion that always emerged when she was in her element. For a moment she forgot the imposing client and the fawning Mr. Abernathy. She was simply a historian sharing a secret with someone. The man, Adrian Thorne, said nothing. He simply listened, his dark eyes fixed on the detail she indicated. The silence stretched, becoming awkward. Amelia felt a familiar flush of self-doubt creep up her neck. Had she said too much? Sounded too pedantic? Richard's voice whispered in her ear. No one cares about your boring trivia, Amelia. She cleared her throat, stepping back. I apologize for rambling. Don't, he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the still air. You're the first person who hasn't tried to sell me on its monetary value. Tell me more about the block cutter. Startled, Amelia launched into a detailed explanation of the printing guilds of the 1550s, the rivalry between Swiss and Venetian artisans, and the subtle clues left behind in their work. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Adrian Thorne never took his eyes off her, his expression unreadable. He asked sharp, intelligent questions that went far beyond mere curiosity. He wasn't just hearing her words. He was processing them, challenging them, engaging with them. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. No one, not even her professors in university, had ever listened to her with such focused intent. When she finally paused a little breathless, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. You know its history, not just its price. He then turned to Mr. Abernathy, his tone shifting from intellectual curiosity to clipped command. I'll take the portfolio, and I want to hire Ms. Hayes for a private project. Amelia blinked, stunned into silence. Mr. Abernathy looked equally shocked, though he recovered quickly. Of course, Mr. Thorne. I'm sure we can arrange for Ms. Hayes's services. No, Adrian interrupted, his gaze flicking back to Amelia. Not through the Chandler collection. I want to hire her directly. I have a private library at my estate. It has been neglected. It requires a curator. Someone who understands that a book's worth is not printed on its title page. He pulled a sleek black business card from his pocket. My assistant will contact you to discuss the terms. I expect to hear from you by tomorrow. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving a profound silence in his wake. Amelia stared at the card in her hand. It was made of heavy matte stock, bearing only a name, Adrian Thorne, and a single phone number. No title, no company. It didn't need one. She might live a cloistered life, but even she knew that name. Adrian Thorne was a legend, a specter in the world of finance and technology, a reclusive billionaire who had built an empire from scratch and was notoriously private, almost pathologically so. He rarely appeared in public and was almost never photographed. And he wanted to hire her. Mr. Abernathy was fussing beside her, a mixture of awe and agitation on his face. My dear girl, do you have any idea who that was? He's the Thorne of Thorne Industries. He could buy this entire city block with his pocket change. But Amelia wasn't thinking about his wealth. She was thinking about the way he had listened to her. The way his eyes had held a flicker of genuine interest, not in her appearance, not in her connections, but in her knowledge. For the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at her and seen not a worthless accessory or a mousy hobbyist, but an expert, a specialist, someone of value. The ghost of Richard's voice tried to whisper its poison. It's a fluke. He's just eccentric. You'll disappoint him. But for the first time, another voice, small and unfamiliar, pushed back. It was the voice of the woman she used to be, the woman who loved history and stories, the woman who had gotten lost somewhere along the way. And it whispered a single revolutionary word, maybe. The address Adrian Thorne's assistant provided was not in Boston proper, but an hour north in a secluded corner of the coastline known for its old money estates. The gates were 20 feet of imposing wrought iron, and the driveway was a mile-long ribbon of crushed stone that wound through a forest of ancient oaks. Amelia's sputtering 12-year-old Honda felt sacrilegious on the pristine gravel. The house, when it finally appeared, was not a house. It was a sprawling, Gilded-Age mansion of granite and limestone that loomed against the moody Atlantic sky, beautiful and forbidding. She was met at the door by a severe-looking woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair, who introduced herself as Mrs. Davenport, the household manager. She led Amelia through a series of rooms that were more museum than home, cavernous halls, with marble floors, furniture that belonged behind velvet ropes, and walls hung with art that made Amelia's art historian heart ache. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but also sterile and silent. The only sounds were their footsteps echoing on the polished stone. The library was at the heart of the mansion, or rather it was the heart. 2 stories high, encircled by a mezzanine of carved mahogany, it was filled with tens of thousands of books. Sunlight streamed through a massive Palladian window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. But Adrian had been right. It was neglected. Books were piled haphazardly. Leather spines were cracking from lack of care, and a faint scent of mildew hung in the air. It was a treasure trove in desperate need of a guardian. Adrian was there standing by the window, silhouetted against the light. "Mrs. Davenport tells me you were on time," he said without turning. "Punctuality is a virtue I appreciate. It's a magnificent collection." Amelia breathed, her eyes scanning the shelves. "Is that a first edition Principia Mathematica?" He finally turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "You have a good eye." "It is. And it is slowly rotting away along with everything else in this room. My father was a collector. I am merely a custodian, a poor one at that." He laid out the terms of his offer. It was staggering. The salary he named was more than she made in 5 years. He offered her a suite of rooms in a private wing of the mansion, full access to the collection, and an unlimited budget for restoration and acquisition. The job was simple: bring the library back to life. Catalog it, preserve it, and curate it. "Why me?" Amelia asked the question, escaping before she could stop it. "You could hire the top academics in the world for a project like this." "I could," he agreed, his gaze steady. "But they would see a collection of assets. They would create a database." "You," he said, taking a step closer, "see a story. You see the hands that held the books, the minds that wrote them. I am not hiring an academic, Ms. Hayes. I am hiring a caretaker of souls. This room is the only part of my father I ever truly respected. I want it honored." The intensity in his voice, the flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, sealed the deal. She accepted. Moving into the Thorne estate was like stepping into another dimension. Her life of thrift and struggle evaporated overnight. Her suite was larger than her entire Boston apartment, with a bedroom overlooking the ocean and a bathroom clad in Italian marble. Meals prepared by a private chef appeared as if by magic. She had everything she could possibly want, and yet it felt like a gilded cage. The staff were polite but distant. The silence of the mansion was even more profound than the silence of her apartment. And Adrian was a ghost. He would disappear for days at a time, managing his global empire from a high-tech office in another wing of the house. Her only real companion was the library. She lost herself in its dusty aisles, her hands reverently tracing the spines of books that had witnessed centuries of history. She created a meticulous cataloging system, her days filled with the comforting routine of research, cleaning, and restoration. For the first time since before she'd met Richard, Amelia felt a sense of purpose. She was no longer just fixing broken things. She was a custodian of legacies. Her isolation was broken one afternoon by the sharp click of heels on the marble floor outside the library. A woman appeared in the doorway, exuding an aura of entitled elegance. She was tall and impossibly chic in a Chanel suit, her features a colder, sharper version of Adrian's. "So, you're the little book mouse my brother has squirreled away?" the woman said, her voice dripping with condescension. She looked Amelia up and down, her gaze lingering on Amelia's simple cotton dress and sensible shoes. The look was dismissive, appraising, and painfully familiar. It was the same look Richard's society friends used to give her. "I'm Amelia Hayes, the curator," Amelia said, keeping her voice even. "I know who you are. I'm Genevieve Thorne," she announced as if presenting a royal title. "And I make it my business to know about the stray animals Adrian brings home." She glided into the room, running a manicured finger over a stack of books, leaving a faint smudge on the dust jacket. "Tell me, Ms. Hayes, what is it that you really do here?" "My brother has a habit of collecting strays, you see. He finds them fascinating." For a time, Then he gets bored and they have to be removed. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. In Genevieve's eyes, Amelia was an intruder, a gold digger who had somehow breached the fortress walls. The old insecurities swirled in Amelia's stomach. She was out of her depth, a commoner trespassing in a palace. Just then, Adrian's voice came from the mezzanine above. "That's enough, Genevieve." He descended the spiral staircase, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the room. He placed himself slightly in front of Amelia, a subtle but clear protective gesture. "Don't be so dramatic, darling," Genevieve said with a brittle laugh. "I was just getting to know our new staff member." "Amelia is not staff," Adrian said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "She is my guest and a respected colleague. She is doing for this library what no one else could. Something you, with all your charity boards and luncheon committees, would never understand: actual meaningful work." Genevieve's face tightened, the mask of bored amusement slipping to reveal a flash of raw fury. The insult had found its mark. She shot Amelia a look of pure venom before turning on her heel and storming out of the library. Adrian turned to Amelia, his expression softening. "I apologize for my sister. She can be territorial." "It's fine," Amelia murmured, though her heart was still pounding. "It's not," he countered. "This is your space, your work. You are not to be disturbed or disrespected here. By anyone." He stood there for a moment, the space between them charged with an unspoken energy. He was her employer, her patron, but in that moment, as he defended her against his own sister, he felt like something more. An ally, a protector. It was a dizzying, terrifying, and profoundly hopeful feeling. But as she watched him walk away, Amelia couldn't shake Genevieve's parting glare. She had made a powerful enemy. The gilded cage had suddenly revealed its bars, and she realized that the ghosts of this house were far more dangerous than the ones in her own memory. Life in the Thorne mansion settled into a strange rhythm. Days were spent in the blissful solitude of the library, where Amelia unearthed one treasure after another: a forgotten manuscript by a female Renaissance poet, a series of letters from a Civil War soldier, a first-edition copy of Moby Dick with a cryptic inscription by Melville himself. Each discovery was a victory, a small piece of her own validation. Her work gave her a confidence that began to radiate outward, softening the tired lines around her eyes and putting a spark of intellectual fire back into her gaze. Evenings, however, were a different matter. More and more often, Adrian would seek her out. He wouldn't summon her. He would simply appear at the library door as the sun began to set, holding 2 glasses and a bottle of ridiculously expensive wine. He'd ask about her day, about the stories she had uncovered on the shelves, and then he would start to share his own. He spoke of his lonely childhood in the cavernous mansion of a father who collected priceless objects, but showed no affection for his own son, and of a mother who had faded into a quiet depression long before she passed away. He spoke of the immense pressure of his name, the crushing weight of an empire he never asked for, but felt duty-bound to command. In the warm glow of the library lamp, surrounded by the ghosts of history, they found a strange kinship. Amelia saw past the billionaire and glimpsed the lonely man beneath. He, in turn, seemed to see past her brokenness to the resilient, passionate woman she was fighting to become. The space between them, once charged with professional courtesy, now hummed with a different, more personal energy. But shadows have a way of creeping into even the most brightly lit rooms. Genevieve Thorne was a master of the shadows. She couldn't attack Amelia directly, not after Adrian's warning, so she began a campaign of insidious psychological warfare. Staff members would suddenly become cold and unhelpful. A priceless book Amelia was restoring would be moved from its climate-controlled case, only to be found by Genevieve in a damp corner of the room. Rumors began to trickle back to Amelia via a sympathetic young housekeeper named Clara. Whispers among the staff planted by Genevieve painted Amelia as a cunning manipulator, a seductress worming her way into the reclusive billionaire's confidence. The whispers reached beyond the estate walls. Amelia discovered to her horror that gossip columns in New York and London had begun to mention Adrian Thorne's mysterious new companion. They printed grainy, long-lens photos of her walking on the estate grounds, describing her as a dowdy divorcee with a checkered past. Amelia knew with a sickening certainty who was feeding them this information. The campaign of whispers was unnerving, but the most painful blow came from the past. One Saturday afternoon, a gleaming silver Bentley crunched up the driveway. Out stepped Richard Sterling. He looked slicker and more polished than ever, his suit ostentatiously expensive, his smile predatory. He had found her. Amelia met him in the grand foyer, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and rage. "What are you doing here, Richard?" "Well, hello to you too, Amelia," he said, his eyes raking over her, taking in her simple but well-made clothes and the unfamiliar confidence in her posture. His gaze swept around the opulent hall, a greedy, envious light in his eyes. "My God. You certainly landed on your feet. I have to admit I'm impressed. I never took you for the ambitious type." "Get out," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Not so fast," he purred, stepping closer. "I heard through the grapevine Cassandra's father sits on a board with one of Thorne's VPs that my little ex-wife was shacked up with the Howard Hughes of our generation. I came to see for myself, and maybe to offer a warning. As a concerned ex-husband, of course. I don't need anything from you." "Oh, I think you do," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man like Thorne doesn't get involved with someone like you for no reason. He's using you, Amelia. For what I don't know. Maybe he has a fetish for charity cases, but when he's done he'll discard you just like everyone else. But I know you. I know your secrets. I can help you navigate this. We could be a team. Imagine what we could get from him." The crudeness of it, the sheer audacity, made her feel ill. He saw her new life not as her achievement, but as an opportunity for him to exploit. He still saw her as his property, an extension of his own ambition. "You're pathetic." She spat the words tasting like venom and freedom. "You come here to this house that I am in because of my talent, something you never even acknowledged, and you try to blackmail me. You are exactly as small and as hollow as I remember. Now leave before I have you thrown out." A flicker of surprise, then rage, crossed his face. He wasn't used to her defiance. He opened his mouth to retort, but Adrian's voice cut through the cavernous space. "Is there a problem here?" Adrian stood at the top of the grand staircase, his expression unreadable, but his presence was a thundercloud. He had clearly heard everything. Richard's demeanor shifted instantly. He plastered on a sycophantic smile. "Adrian Thorne. Richard Sterling. Sterling and Vanguard. A great admirer of your work." He extended a hand that Adrian completely ignored. Adrian descended the stairs slowly, his eyes locked on Richard. "I know who you are, and I know what you are. You have 5 seconds to remove yourself from my property before I call security and have you cited for trespassing." His voice was deathly calm, which made it all the more menacing. Richard's face paled. He shot Amelia a look that was a toxic cocktail of hatred and thwarted greed, then turned and scurried out the door like the rat he was. The silence he left behind was heavy. "I'm sorry," Amelia whispered, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "I don't know how he found me." "It wasn't your fault," Adrian said, his eyes searching her face. "But he will be back. Men like that are vermin. They always circle back to what they think they own." He paused, his gaze intense. "And my sister? She is no better. She sees you as a threat to her position. They will work together. They will try to destroy you to get to me." He was stating it as a fact, not a possibility. In that moment, Amelia understood the true nature of the world she had entered. It was a world of gilded surfaces and shadowy depths, of immense power and profound paranoia. She wasn't just a curator in a library anymore. She was a piece on a very dangerous chessboard. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I want you to be prepared," he said, "and because I don't want you to leave." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. "This house was a tomb before you came, Amelia. You brought it back to life. You bring me back to life." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, a spark of warmth in the cold, cavernous foyer. It was a gesture of profound intimacy that said more than any words could. It was a declaration of allegiance, but it was also a declaration of war. By choosing her, he had drawn the battle lines. And Amelia knew with a chilling certainty that Richard and Genevieve would not rest until they saw her broken and cast out once more. The whispers were about to become a storm. The Thorne Foundation's annual Acquisitions Gala was the crown jewel of the Boston social calendar. It was a night where old money and new tech collided, a high-stakes performance of wealth and influence held for the first time in the grand ballroom of the Thorne estate. For weeks the mansion had been in a state of controlled chaos, as florists, caterers, and event planners swarmed the grounds. For Amelia it was the night she had been dreading. Adrian had insisted she attend not as his curator but as his partner, his guest of honor. It was to be her public debut. It was also, she knew, the stage Genevieve and Richard had chosen for their final brutal act. Amelia stood before the mirror in her suite, scarcely recognizing the woman staring back. Adrian had commissioned a dress for her from a designer in Paris. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that shimmered like a star-dusted sky. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and around her neck lay a delicate diamond necklace, a gift from Adrian, who had simply left the velvet box on her pillow with a note that said, "For the woman who illuminates every room she enters." She looked elegant, poised, beautiful even. But inside her stomach was a knot of anxiety. The ghost of Richard's voice was screaming at her. "Imposter! You don't belong! They'll all see you for the worthless little fraud you are." Adrian appeared in the doorway of her sitting room, breathtakingly handsome in a classic black tuxedo. He stopped short when he saw her. The look in his eyes a mixture of awe, admiration, and something deeper. Something fiercely protective silenced the ghost in her head for a moment. "Amelia," he breathed. "You are incandescent." He offered her his arm, his touch a steadying warmth against her bare skin. "Ready for battle," he murmured, his voice for her ears only. She took a deep breath. "Ready." Walking into the ballroom on Adrian's arm was like stepping into a piranha tank. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by a tidal wave of whispers. Hundreds of pairs of eyes followed them, dissecting her, judging her. She could feel Genevieve's malevolent gaze from across the room where she stood talking to a small group, Richard Sterling smirking by her side. They looked like a pair of beautifully dressed vultures. The evening was a blur of introductions to senators, CEOs, and titans of industry. Amelia handled it with a grace she didn't know she possessed, discussing art history and the Foundation's work with an easy intelligence that surprised everyone, including herself. Adrian never left her side, his presence a silent shield. The climax of the evening was the auction of a newly acquired centerpiece for the Foundation, a recently discovered set of correspondence from Benjamin Franklin, written during his time in Paris. Adrian was set to give a speech before the bidding began. As he walked toward the stage, Genevieve made her move. She intercepted him, a champagne flute in her hand, and with a practiced, clumsy-looking stumble she accidentally spilled the entire contents down the front of his shirt. "Oh, Adrian, darling, I'm so dreadfully sorry," she cried, dabbing at his shirt with a napkin, a picture of insincere remorse. "You must go and change immediately." "Don't worry," she added, turning to the crowd with a triumphant smile. "I can handle the presentation. And I believe our dear Richard Sterling, a man of considerable financial acumen, has agreed to help me." It was a perfectly executed coup. Adrian was forced off stage, leaving the floor to his enemies. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Genevieve took the microphone, her voice smooth as silk. "While my brother is recovering from my little mishap, we thought we'd move on to our most prized acquisition. The Franklin letters. She gestured to the letters displayed in a climate-controlled glass case on the stage. Richard stepped forward, a condescending smirk on his face. "A remarkable find," he began, his voice booming with false authority. "And a remarkable investment. But in the world of high-stakes collecting, provenance is everything. And there have been some whispers concerning the authentication of these documents." He let the accusation hang in the air. The room fell silent. "The authentication," Richard continued, his eyes finding Amelia in the crowd and pinning her with his gaze, "was overseen by the Foundation's new curator, Ms. Amelia Hayes. A woman with, shall we say, a rather obscure background. One has to wonder if a person of her limited experience could be trusted with an acquisition of this magnitude. It would be a terrible embarrassment for the Foundation if these letters were later found to be forgeries. It was a vicious public assassination. He was destroying her professional credibility, framing her as either incompetent or worse, complicit in a fraud. He was weaponizing her past, her worthlessness, against her. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of shock and salacious interest. Amelia felt the floor drop out from under her. She wanted to run, to disappear. But then she saw it. A tiny detail on one of the displayed letters. A watermark. It was the same watermark she had studied for weeks, the one that had proven the letter's authenticity. And it was the same watermark on a set of papers she'd seen in a different context. Papers Richard had once shown her from a shady dealer he knew, bragging about how they were perfect for creating historical reproductions. He wasn't just questioning the letters. He was the source of the potential forgery. This wasn't just an attack. It was a frame-up. Something inside her snapped. The fear, the doubt, the years of feeling small and silenced, it all burned away, replaced by a cold, clear rage. She was not the same broken woman he had divorced. She was the caretaker of souls. She was an expert. And this was her territory. She began to walk toward the stage, her steps purposeful and steady. The crowd parted before her. She took a second microphone from a stunned-looking assistant. "You're right about one thing, Richard," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent ballroom. "Provenance is everything." She turned to the audience. "These letters are without a doubt authentic. I spent over 100 hours verifying them myself. The paper is 18th century linen rag consistent with Franklin's known suppliers. The iron gall ink has oxidized in a way that can only be achieved over 2 centuries. But the most definitive proof," she said, her eyes locking with Richard's, "is the watermark. A small, unique fleur-de-lis, the mark of a specific paper maker in Passy, France, whose workshop we know Franklin frequented." She paused, letting the information sink in. "It's a very rare watermark. In fact, I've only seen it once before. On a batch of blank 18th century paper that a particularly unscrupulous antiques dealer was trying to sell a few years ago. He was peddling it to forgers. A man I used to know was very interested in that paper. He thought it was a brilliant investment." Richard's face went white. He knew she was talking about him. "What a coincidence." Amelia continued, her voice dripping with ice. "That whispers about these letters being forgeries should come from the one man who once contemplated commissioning such forgeries himself. It almost seems as if he might be trying to devalue the authentic article so that he or an associate could purchase it at a bargain price. Or perhaps he's simply trying to discredit the person who could most easily expose him." The unmasking was complete. She hadn't just defended herself. She had exposed his character, his corruption, his pathetic, grasping greed in front of the most powerful people in the city. Genevieve stood frozen, her plan having backfired in the most spectacular way. Just then Adrian reappeared on the stage. His shirt was still damp, but his eyes were blazing with pride. He walked straight to Amelia, took the microphone, and addressed the stunned crowd. "It seems we owe Ms. Hayes a debt of gratitude," he said, his voice resonating with power. "Not only for her impeccable work in authenticating these letters, but for her courage in defending their integrity and the integrity of this foundation from baseless and malicious attacks." He looked from Richard's ashen face to his sister's furious one. The Thorne Foundation has no tolerance for fraud, nor for those who would attempt to manipulate our work for their own petty games." He then turned to Amelia. He didn't touch her, but his next words were more intimate than any embrace. "The centerpiece of tonight's auction is not the Franklin letters. It is the brilliant woman who saved them." He began to applaud. Slowly at first, then thunderously the entire room joined in. They were not applauding a billionaire's new girlfriend. They were applauding a hero, a quiet, forgotten woman who had found her voice and used it to slay her dragons in a room full of giants. In the glare of 100 spotlights, Amelia Hayes stood tall, no longer an echo, but a roar. The fallout from the gala was swift and brutal. Richard Sterling's world imploded. The story of his public humiliation, coupled with Adrian's quiet behind-the-scenes influence, was a death knell for his career. Phones at Sterling and Vanguard rang with calls from furious clients pulling their investments. Cassandra Vanderbilt's father, a man who valued reputation above all else, broke the engagement within 24 hours. Richard was ruined, exposed as the hollow, grasping man he had always been. He vanished from the society pages, becoming a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Genevieve Thorne's punishment was more personal and in many ways more severe. Adrian confronted her in the cold light of the morning after. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. He simply informed her that she was being removed from the board of the Thorne Foundation effective immediately. Her access to the family's private trust was being suspended pending a full review. He wasn't disowning her, but he was stripping her of the two things she valued most: power and money. He was forcing her to confront a life without the Thorne name as her shield and her sword. For Genevieve, it was a fate worse than exile. Amelia watched the wreckage from the calm sanctuary of the library. She felt no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. Just a quiet, profound sense of release, as if a heavy cloak she had been wearing for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. A week after the gala, Adrian found her perched on a ladder, carefully dusting a row of 17th-century philosophy texts. He didn't say anything, just watched her for a moment, an unreadable expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice making her look down, "about this library. It's more than a collection. It's a living history. It needs more than a curator. It needs a director, someone with vision." He pulled a thick sheaf of documents from a leather portfolio. "These are the incorporation papers for a new independent trust. I'm endowing it with $100 million to start. Its mission will be to preserve historical texts and artifacts and to fund literacy programs in underserved communities. It will be called the Hayes Thorne Legacy Foundation." Amelia stared at him, her heart seeming to stop. Hayes Thorne. "I can think of no one better to run it," he said, his voice soft but certain. "I want you to be its president. You'll have full autonomy, a board of directors you choose, a mission you define." This was his grand gesture, not a diamond ring or a flashy car, not a marriage proposal whispered in the dark. It was something far more meaningful. He wasn't just offering her his world, he was giving her a world of her own to build. He was seeing her not as an appendage to his life, but as a force in her own right. He was recognizing her talent, her passion, her worth, and giving it a name and a legacy. This was her crown. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of the man standing before her. They weren't tears of sadness or relief, but of a joy so profound it was painful. "Adrian, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he whispered, moving to the base of the ladder and looking up at her. The vast, intimidating space of the library seemed to shrink, creating a world that contained only the two of them. "Say you'll build this with me." She descended the ladder and stood before him, the incorporation papers clutched in her hand. For a decade, another man had defined her worth by what she lacked. Now this man was defining it by the immense scope of her potential. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will." He didn't kiss her then. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a gesture of partnership, of equality. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me," he said. His dark eyes filled with a raw honesty that humbled her. "My name, my money, my power. You are the only person who ever simply wanted to talk to me about a book." In that moment, Amelia understood. He had been just as trapped in his gilded cage as she had been in her prison of worthlessness. They were two lonely souls who had found each other in a dusty, forgotten library. He hadn't rescued her, and she hadn't saved him. They had together created a space where they could both be free. Later that night, he led her out onto a stone balcony overlooking the restless Atlantic. The moon cast a silver path across the inky water. He finally drew her into his arms, and when he kissed her, it wasn't a kiss of passionate, desperate romance. It was a kiss of deep, quiet understanding. It was a kiss that tasted of homecoming. She was no longer Amelia Hayes, the worthless ex-wife. She was Amelia Hayes, president of the Hayes-Thorne Legacy Foundation. A woman of substance, of purpose. A woman crowned not by a tiara, but by respect. A woman who had been through the fire, and emerged not scorched but forged in gold like the kintsugi pottery she so loved. She had taken the broken pieces of her life and made them into something stronger, more beautiful than they had ever been before. And beside her stood a man who didn't see the scars. He only saw the light that shone through the cracks. 2 years passed. The Hayes-Thorne Legacy Foundation became a quiet powerhouse in the worlds of philanthropy and historical preservation. Under Amelia's guidance, it did not merely acquire artifacts, it breathed life back into them. It funded the digitization of fragile manuscripts, making them accessible to scholars worldwide. It saved crumbling historical libraries in small towns, and it launched a mobile literacy program, a library on wheels that brought books to children in remote, impoverished areas. Amelia, once a reclusive restorer, was now a respected leader, known for her sharp intellect, her fierce passion, and her deep empathy. She gave speeches at conferences and met with academics, her voice no longer a hesitant whisper, but a confident, resonant instrument of change. The Thorne mansion was transformed. The silence was no longer sterile and intimidating. It was peaceful. Laughter now echoed in the grand halls, the laughter of the children from the Foundation's programs who came for special tours, their eyes wide with wonder at the library. The house was no longer a monument to a lonely past, but a beacon for a hopeful future. Amelia and Adrian built a life that was both extraordinary and wonderfully ordinary. They were a power couple, their names appearing in articles about global philanthropy, but they guarded their private time fiercely. Their evenings were not spent at society galas, but in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth, debating a line of poetry or planning their next project. He taught her how to sail his yacht, and she taught him the delicate art of bookbinding. He found peace in the quiet, meticulous work, and she found freedom in the vast, open ocean. They were partners in every sense of the word. He trusted her vision for the Foundation implicitly, and she became his most valued confidant, a sounding board for the complex decisions his empire demanded. She didn't just share his life. She enriched it, challenged it, and gave it a purpose beyond the accumulation of wealth. One crisp autumn afternoon, Amelia stood on the balcony overlooking the sea, a cup of tea warming her hands. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, her hair loose in the wind. She was watching the Foundation's bookmobile make its way back up the long driveway after a day spent at a local community center. Adrian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Look at what you've built," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. She leaned back against him, a contented smile on her face. "What we've built." A piece of mail had arrived that morning, forwarded from her old Boston address. It was a crumpled, wine-stained announcement from a cut-rate wedding chapel in Las Vegas. A small blurry photo showed Richard Sterling looking bloated and tired beside a woman with brassy hair and a desperate smile. He had married his secretary. It was a pathetic postscript to a chapter of her life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. She had glanced at it, felt not a flicker of anger or pain, only a distant detached pity, and had dropped it into the recycling bin without a second thought. The ghost of his voice was gone. The word worthless had lost its power. It was just a meaningless sound, a relic from a buried past. Her worth was not something that could be given or taken away by a man. It was something she had forged herself in the quiet hours spent with broken things, in the courage it took to speak her truth in a room full of enemies, and in the love she now shared with a man who saw her truly and completely. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian murmured into her hair. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She looked into his dark, intense eyes, the eyes that had seen her value when she couldn't see it herself. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty that a broken thing can become more beautiful than it ever was before. You just need the right person to see its story. He smiled a genuine soul-deep smile that was reserved only for her, and lowered his head to kiss her. And in that kiss by the sea, in the life they had built together, was the quiet, triumphant, and everlasting truth of her own precious legacy. Her story wasn't a fairy tale about a poor girl being rescued by a prince. It was the story of a queen who had forgotten she had a crown, and the quiet king who simply reminded her where to find it, not on her head, but in her own capable hands. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a story can change a life. Amelia's journey from being called worthless by the man who should have cherished her to being crowned a queen by a billionaire who saw her true value is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It's a reminder that our worth is not defined by those who try to tear us down, but by the strength we find within ourselves to rise above the ashes. If her story of resilience, courage, and finding love against all odds touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up to let us know. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories that prove that sometimes the best revenge is building a life more beautiful than the one that was taken from you. Click that subscribe button and join our community.